Okay, in this video we're going to talk about weathering. All right, and there's two words that kind of go hand in hand. One is weathering, the other is erosion, and sometimes they can kind of get confused. In this video we're just going to be talking about weathering. All right, so what makes the difference between weathering and erosion is that weathering is just the breaking down of rocks into essentially into smaller rocks, and the erosion is when those rocks get carried away somehow. All right, so weathering. All right, weathering is the breaking down and changing of rocks at or near the Earth's surface. All right, and there's two major types of weathering. All right, mechanical and chemical. All right, whenever you think mechanical, think of essentially like if you were to take a hammer and just beat on a rock. All right, you're not chemically changing the rock at all. You're just breaking it by using force. All right, so mechanical weathering is what occurs when physical forces break rocks apart into smaller and smaller pieces without changing the mineral composition. All right. So if you had one big rock, and it got broken down into all these smaller rocks, this rock right here is chemically the same as the original large rock. All right. So the one thing that mechanical weathering does is it increases the surface area. All right. And one way to think about this is to think about like, okay, well, this big rock right here could be broken apart into all of these smaller rocks. All right, but let's pretend that we wanted to paint this entire rock, but we also wanted to paint all of these rocks right here, which would require more paint. All right, the answer is this right here. All right, and the reason that it would take more paint to cover all the surfaces of these rocks right here is that there's just more surface. All right. Here you would just need enough paint to paint the outside of this, but once it's broken down into smaller bits, there's more surfaces that could be painted. All right, so that's essentially a way of describing surface area. It's the total area of all the surfaces of all the rocks. All right, and the smaller the pieces, the more surface area you're going to have. Okay, so there's three processes that can cause mechanical weathering. All right. The first one is what's called frost wedging. All right, and frost wedging happens simply because ice expands. All right, so the process goes something like this. All right, let's say that you've got a small crack in a rock. All right, well, if it rains, that water can get into that crack. All right, and then let's pretend that it gets cold at night. Well, what happens is that when that water freezes, it expands a little bit. All right, and so it forces these rocks apart a little bit, and when that happens, that can cause these rocks to crack. All right, so when this happens, you end up creating a lot of smaller rocks, and a lot of times in the mountains, this will create a lot of large piles called talus that form at the base of a lot of these rocky cliffs. All right, so what you have here, so up higher in the mountains, you have a lot of frost wedging going on. Yeah, you're always getting water getting into the cracks and freezing, and that breaks off these smaller rocks, and then they accumulate down here. All right, so these are all the smaller rocks that got formed from the weathering that occurred up here. All right, another type of weathering is unloading / exfoliation. All right, so essentially this happens when igneous rock, the reduced pressure on igneous rocks causes it to expand, and it allows slabs of outer rock to break off into layers in a process called exfoliation. All right, so essentially what happens is you've got this outer layer of rock, and then you've got this rock underneath that's basically wanting to get larger. All right, so it's kind of like think of this like a balloon right here. And when that gets larger, it's going to break the rock on the outside is a little bit more brittle, and it breaks off. All right, and you can see that happening right here. You've got these slabs of rock that are going to be breaking off and eventually sliding down the side of this hill. A third thing that can cause mechanical weathering is biological activity. All right, one of the major things that way this happens is by roots. All right, a lot of times you'll see trees growing essentially straight into rock surfaces, and the tree is going to want to put its roots in whatever crack it can find. All right, and when that happens, when that root grows bigger, it can crack that rock apart. All right, a lot of times you'll see this on old sidewalks, where there's a tree where the roots grew underneath the sidewalk, and over time that root pushed that sidewalk up. All right, grass can do this, and animals can also do this. All right, one little it's not exactly doing this with rock, but I can tell you that this happens on tennis courts a lot, where you get a crack, and you're as long as grass doesn't grow in that crack, a lot of times the crack won't grow that fast. But once grass starts growing in there, the action of the roots growing underneath will essentially break up the surface. All right, and the same thing happens with rocks. Okay, so the opposite of mechanical weathering is chemical weathering, and that's when and this is the breakup of a rock when you're using a chemical process to do it. All right, so when this happens, you're actually changing the rock into a new chemical substance. All right, so some of the ways that this can happen, all right, usually it involves water. All right, and there's things that can dissolve in water. All right, one of the things that can dissolve in water is oxygen. All right, and one thing that can do is it can react with iron, which is Fe, that's in the rocks, and that creates rust. All right, another thing that is often dissolved in water is carbon dioxide. When that happens, you end up forming this chemical called carbonic acid, and that can act to dissolve away a lot of the minerals that are in the rocks. All right, and a third one is sulfur and nitrogen oxides. That happens from acid rain, and that can dissolve away and break up the rocks as well. So not all weathering happens at the same rate. All right, so a couple sometimes weathering can happen kind of fast, sometimes it happens slow, and this is affected by a couple of factors. All right, one is the rock characteristics. All right, does it have cracks and jagged edges? For example, frost wedging. Frost wedging is only going to be really effective if you've got rocks that have cracks in them. All right, if there are no cracks in the rock, there isn't a place for water to get in there and freeze. All right, so that's the rock characteristics is one thing that's going to affect weathering. All right, climate is a huge factor. All right, so one thing about chemical weathering happens a lot faster when it's warm than when it's cold. All right, so chemical weathering doesn't really happen a lot in really, really cold climates. All right, it's most effective in warm, humid climates where you've got a lot of heat and a lot of moisture. All right, and one other thing is this thing called differential weathering. All right, and that's whenever you have essentially two different types of rocks. All right, this right here is an example of differential weathering, where you used to have, this is where a volcano used to be, and the outside of the volcano got weathered away, and what that left was just the center part of the volcano.